The tension in the dining room was palpable as my husband's family deliberately set one less place at the table than needed. Their message was crystal clear. I wasn't welcome. Little did they know that evening would change everything when his commanding officer arrived and declared firmly, "Major, your seat is here." It was the moment that would finally force them to acknowledge my existence after months of calculated exclusion. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Texas sun was setting as we pulled into the driveway of my in-laws' sprawling ranch-style home. I smoothed down my civilian clothes, a simple blouse and slacks that felt foreign after years in uniform, and caught my husband's reassuring smile. "They're going to love you," he said, squeezing my hand. But the slight tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. I had faced insurgents in combat zones with less trepidation than I felt approaching this dinner. After 15 years of military service and rising to the rank of major, I found myself nervous about a family gathering, an irony not lost on me. The invitation had come unexpectedly. My mother-in-law had called last week, her voice dripping with southern sweetness. "We simply must have you over for a proper family dinner," she'd insisted. "It's high time everyone welcomed you properly." As we walked up the flagstone path, the scent of smoked brisket wafted through the evening air. My stomach growled, reminding me I'd skipped lunch to prepare for this evening, mentally and emotionally. My husband rang the doorbell, then immediately opened the door anyway. "Mom? Dad? We're here," he called out, his voice shifting to a higher, almost childlike tone I rarely heard. The house was exactly as he described. Walls adorned with family photos spanning generations, leather furniture worn to comfortable perfection, and everywhere, subtle nods to Texas heritage. A large dining table dominated the adjacent room, already set with china that looked too delicate to touch. His mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "There you are," she said, embracing her son warmly before turning to me with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And here's our military girl." Not major, not even my name, just military girl. More relatives appeared from the living room. His father with a firm handshake, his sister with a quick, cold hug, cousins and aunts and uncles whose names blurred together. Each greeting felt like an assessment I was failing. "So you outrank our boy, do you?" His uncle chuckled, clapping my husband's shoulder. "Must make things interesting at home." The laughter that followed had an edge to it. I smiled politely. Years of military discipline keeping my expression neutral, despite the discomfort crawling up my spine. As we moved toward the living room, I caught whispers behind cupped hands. "So stiff," someone murmured. "Thinks she's better than us," added another. Despite my years commanding troops and making life or death decisions, I suddenly felt diminished, a stranger in enemy territory with no clear path to victory. We gathered around a long dining table, the centerpiece of my in-laws' San Antonio home. The polished oak surface gleamed under soft lighting, each place meticulously set with heavy silverware and thick white porcelain plates that spoke of family traditions and Sunday gatherings. My husband took his seat beside me, his shoulders tense despite his attempt at a reassuring smile. "Pass the brisket, would you?" my father-in-law called from the head of the table, his voice carrying the distinctive Texas drawl that seemed to deepen whenever I was present. The serving dishes began their journey around the table. Steaming bowls of green beans seasoned with bacon, wicker baskets overflowing with golden cornbread, and platters of sliced brisket that had been smoking since dawn. I watched as my sister-in-law heaped food onto her plate before passing the dishes to her brother, my husband. He served himself, then hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to pass the food to me. But before he could, my mother-in-law intercepted, reaching across with practiced efficiency. "Let me help you with that," she said, taking the dishes and passing them directly to the guest on my other side. I stared down at my empty place setting, the pristine white plate reflecting the overhead light like a spotlight on my exclusion. The absence of food was deafening, a silent declaration that I didn't belong at this table. When I finally looked up, my mother-in-law's eyes met mine across the arrangement of sunflowers and candles. Her lips curled into a smug smirk, the kind that dared me to make a scene. Around me, forks clinked against plates and conversation resumed, though noticeably quieter. I caught fragments of whispered judgments that weren't meant to be quite so audible. "She's just so military," someone murmured from down the table. "Too bossy for her own good," agreed another voice, followed by a knowing chuckle. "Not what I pictured for him at all," my mother-in-law responded, not bothering to lower her voice. My husband stared fixedly at his plate, jaw working as he chewed mechanically. I recognized his conflict, torn between standing up for me and maintaining peace with the family he'd known his entire life. Under the table, I pressed my palms against my thighs, channeling the composure that had carried me through military briefings and combat zones. The empty plate before me wasn't just about food. It was a boundary drawn, a message delivered with Southern passive aggression. I might have earned my major's rank, but in this house, I had not earned my place at the table. Throughout dinner, I sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching everyone else enjoy the Southern feast while I faced an empty plate. The conversation flowed, around me like water around a stone, occasionally splashing me with thinly veiled insults. My sister-in-law leaned across the table, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You know, Major, you should really learn to relax and let the men talk about important things. Nobody likes a woman who's always giving orders." Her eyes glittered with satisfaction as several relatives chuckled, while others studied their plates with sudden interest. "I've heard military women make terrible wives," she continued, raising her voice just enough to ensure everyone heard. "Always bringing their work home, right?" She glanced meaningfully at my husband, who shifted uncomfortably beside me, but remained silent. A cousin I'd only met twice before took the opportunity to join in. He sidled closer, his breath hot against my ear as he whispered, "Must be hard for him, you know." "You're taking his career spotlight. Men in this family are supposed to be the successful ones." He nodded toward my husband. "Bet it's emasculating having a wife who outranks him." I maintained my composure, drawing on years of military discipline. The dining room, with its polished oak table and family photos lining the walls, had transformed from a gathering place into a battlefield where the weapons were words and exclusion. My father-in-law cleared his throat from the head of the table, the position that traditionally signified respect and authority in Southern households. "In this family," he announced, raising his glass, "we value traditional roles. Always have." His gaze settled on me briefly before moving away, making his point without directly addressing me. Even the neighbors who had been invited seemed uncomfortable. An older woman across the table offered me a sympathetic glance before quickly looking away when my mother-in-law noticed. The tension in the room was palpable, pressing against my chest and making it difficult to breathe. The clink of silverware against plates, the passing of serving dishes that never reached me, the murmured conversations punctuated by laughter whenever someone made a comment at my expense. It all blended into a symphony of rejection. I sat straight-backed in my chair, the way I would during a difficult briefing. The military had taught me to endure discomfort with dignity, but nothing in my training had prepared me for this particular battlefield. Had there been food on my plate, I couldn't have swallowed a single bite through the knot in my throat. The silence around the table felt heavier than any rucksack I'd carried through basic training. My husband sat beside me, his posture rigid and uncomfortable, knuckles turning white as he gripped his fork with unnecessary force. I searched his face for any sign of support, but he kept his eyes fixed on his plate, methodically cutting his brisket into perfect squares, as if the precision of this task could somehow shield him from the conflict unfolding at the dinner table. I recognized the look on his face, the same expression he wore whenever he felt caught between two loyalties. His shoulders hunched slightly forward, creating a physical barrier between his family and me. The distance between us, though only inches, stretched like miles. Just 3 days earlier, we had argued in our kitchen about this very dinner. "They think you act like an officer at home," he had said, his voice apologetic yet tinged with frustration. "They don't understand the military mindset." "And you?" I had asked. "Do you think I'm too commanding?" He had hesitated just long enough for his silence to become an answer. Now, as his mother's smirk grew more pronounced and his sister's whispers became less subtle, I waited for him to say something, anything, to acknowledge the deliberate slight of my empty plate, but the words never came. Instead, he reached for his water glass, taking a long, slow sip that seemed designed to avoid conversation. I understood the weight of family tradition pressing down on him. 3 generations of his family had lived in the San Antonio neighborhood. His grandparents' wedding photo hung in the hallway, alongside portraits of every family milestone. In this house, loyalty to family came first, a principle drilled into him since childhood. But I was his family now, too. I watched as he nodded along to his father's comments about community reputation, his face a careful mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts. When his mother passed another dish that skipped my place setting entirely, he flinched almost imperceptibly, but remained silent. The military had taught me to endure discomfort without complaint, to stand firm under pressure. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was supposed to be family. I had faced down hostile situations in uniform, yet somehow this dinner table felt more dangerous, the weapons more personal. My husband shifted in his chair, clearing his throat as if about to speak, but then seemed to think better of it. His loyalty was being tested tonight, stretched between the family who raised him and the woman he married. And in that moment of crisis, he chose neither. Trapped instead in the no man's land of indecision, unable to defend me or confront the traditions that held him captive. The hallway felt narrower than it actually was, the family photos lining the walls seeming to watch us with the same judgment I'd felt at the table. My husband gently pulled me by the elbow into the shadow between the living room and kitchen, where the murmur of conversation couldn't reach us. His face was drawn, eyes unable to meet mine. "I need to tell you something," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the clinking of dishes being cleared in the dining room. "They didn't want you here tonight." The words hung in the air between us. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made my stomach tighten. I stood straighter, my military bearing taking over instinctively. "Your parents made that abundantly clear," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the hurt coursing through me. He ran his hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd grown to recognize during our marriage. "I fought for you to be included," he continued, words tumbling out faster now. "I told them it was important, that you're my wife and deserve to be here, but—" His voice trailed off. "But you couldn't stand up to them when it mattered," I finished for him. My husband nodded, shame evident in his slumped shoulders. "I thought if we just showed up, they'd have to accept it." "I didn't expect them to." He gestured vaguely toward the dining room, unable to name the humiliation they'd subjected me to. I took a deep breath, processing this new information. The knowledge that he'd at least attempted to advocate for me offered small comfort against the reality of his silence at the table. Part of me understood his conflict, torn between loyalty to his parents and to me. but another part ached with disappointment. "Do you know what hurts most?" I asked, my voice finally betraying a tremor. Not the empty plate or the whispers. "It's watching you sit there while they treated me like I was invisible." He reached for my hand, his touch tentative. "I'm sorry. I just, I freeze up around them. Always have." The apology felt insufficient against the weight of what had transpired. In the army, I'd faced down far more intimidating situations than a family dinner. Yet here I stood, wounded by the passive cruelty of people who were supposed to become my family. "Your mother looked me in the eye when she passed that serving dish right over me," I said. "She knew exactly what she was doing." My husband nodded, misery etched across his features. "They think you're changing me, pulling me away from how they raised me." This confession confirmed my worst fears about my place in this family. I wasn't just an outsider. I was perceived as a threat to their traditions, their values, their control over their son. The realization settled heavily on my shoulders as we stood in that dimly lit hallway, the gulf between us suddenly seeming wider than ever before. I stepped onto the back porch for a breath of air, desperate to escape the suffocating tension inside. The Texas night was thick with humidity, clinging to my skin like the discomfort of the evening itself. Through the screen door, I could still hear the clinking of silverware and forced laughter from the dining room. That's when I caught the low rumble of my father-in-law's voice. He stood at the far end of the porch with two neighbors, their silhouettes illuminated by the yellow porch light. They hadn't noticed me in the shadows. "She's just too cold," he said, gesturing with his drink. "Military through and through. Not the kind of woman who makes a house a home." One of the neighbors nodded sympathetically. "Must be hard on your boy." "James deserved someone softer," my father-in-law continued. "Not marriage material, if you ask me. Too focused on her career. Outranks him, for God's sake." The words sliced through me with surgical precision. I'd faced down insurgents and navigated war zones, yet somehow these casual dismissals wounded deeper than I cared to admit. The other neighbor, a woman in her 60s, clicked her tongue. "And she doesn't plan to leave the service? Start a family?" "Says she wants both," he scoffed. "Can't have it all, that's what I tell James." I pressed my back against the wall, feeling suddenly exposed despite the darkness. This wasn't just family friction. This was community-wide character assassination. In San Antonio's tight-knit military circles, reputation was currency. My father-in-law was systematically devaluing mine with every conversation. The realization settled heavily. Their judgment extended far beyond the dining room table. Every slight tonight, the empty plate, the whispered comments, my husband's painful silence, was part of a larger message broadcast throughout their social circle. I would never truly belong. I thought about the women in my battalion who looked up to me, the junior officers who sought my mentorship. Here, just miles from the base where I commanded respect, I was reduced to an inconvenient obstacle in their son's life. The conversation shifted to local gossip, but the damage was done. I slipped back inside, straightening my posture instinctively. Military bearing had gotten me through worse. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. What I didn't know then was how quickly the tables would turn, how one unexpected ally would transform this humiliation into something entirely different. But in that moment, standing alone in the hallway of my husband's childhood home, I felt the full weight of being an outsider marked for rejection. The tension in the dining room was suffocating. I sat with an empty plate before me, the weight of my in-laws' disapproval heavier than any rucksack I'd carried during training. The clink of silverware against china and forced laughter created a soundtrack to my humiliation. Then, everything changed. A sharp, authoritative knock cut through the chatter like a drill sergeant's command. 3 deliberate raps that silenced every voice at the table. The distinct sound of military boots on tile followed, a rhythm I knew by heart after years of service. My mother-in-law's smile faltered as she rose from her chair, smoothing her dress with suddenly nervous hands. My husband straightened beside me, his posture instinctively shifting to attention even in civilian clothes. Colonel James Anderson strode into the dining room with the quiet confidence that comes from years of command. The battalion commander filled the doorway, his presence immediately dominating the space. He wore his dress uniform, medals gleaming under the chandelier light, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes. "Good evening," he said, voice carrying that unmistakable note of authority that makes even civilians stand straighter. The room fell silent. My father-in-law half rose, clearly uncertain about the protocol for having a high-ranking officer appear unexpectedly at his dinner table. The sister-in-law, who had been whispering about me moments before, now stared wide-eyed at the commander. Colonel Anderson surveyed the table with the practiced gaze of a man accustomed to assessing situations quickly. His eyes found me immediately, noting my empty plate with a flicker of controlled anger. "Major," he addressed me by rank, not as someone's wife or daughter-in-law, but as the officer I was. The title rang out in the silence, reclaiming my identity in this house where they'd tried to strip it away. My husband's relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. They hadn't expected anyone to witness their calculated slight, least of all someone who outranked everyone in the room. The colonel's gaze swept across the table again, taking in the full plate surrounding my empty one. His expression remained professional, but those of us who had served under him recognized the steel beneath his calm exterior. "Major," he repeated, gesturing toward the head of the table. "Your seat is here." His voice filled the dining room, leaving no room for argument or misinterpretation. It wasn't a suggestion. In the language of military command, it was an order, one that acknowledged my rank and the respect it deserved. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted irreversibly. The family that had tried to diminish me now sat frozen, caught in an act of disrespect they couldn't explain away. The room fell into stunned silence as Colonel Anderson addressed me by rank. "Major," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of command that had silenced drill sergeants and subordinates alike. Every eye in the dining room fixed on us, some wide with surprise, others narrowed with sudden calculation. Colonel Anderson gestured toward the head of the table with a practiced formality that left no room for argument. "Your seat is here," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as an established fact. In military culture, such positioning was unmistakable, a deliberate acknowledgement of hierarchy and respect that everyone in the room, military or civilian, could understand. My mother-in-law's mouth opened slightly, then closed without a word. The fork in my father-in-law's hand hovered midway to his lips, forgotten. Even my husband straightened his posture instinctively, a reflex from his years of service. "I believe the major deserves proper recognition in this household," the colonel continued, his tone pleasant but firm. He nodded toward my empty plate, and the message couldn't have been clearer had he spelled it out. The dynamic in the room shifted like sand beneath a sudden tide. My sister-in-law, who minutes before had been whispering snide comments behind her napkin, now sat upright, her expression carefully neutral. The cousin who had mocked my rank suddenly found great interest in rearranging his silverware. "Of course," my mother-in-law finally managed, her southern accent thickening as it always did when she was flustered. "We were just about to—" "Wonderful," Colonel Anderson interrupted with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of every gaze as I moved toward the head of the table. My military training kept my steps measured and my face composed, though inside, Emotions warred between vindication and lingering hurt. The relatives who had excluded me now scrambled to appear welcoming. Chairs scraped against hardwood as people shifted to make room. Someone hurriedly cleared the place setting at the head of the table, while another fetched a clean plate from the kitchen. "We have the utmost respect for our military," my father-in-law announced to the room, as if his earlier comments on the porch had never happened. He nodded vigorously, looking to the neighbors for confirmation. As I took my seat, I caught my husband's eye across the table. Relief mingled with shame on his face. Relief that someone had finally stood up for me. Shame that it hadn't been him. I gave him a small nod. Neither forgiveness nor accusation, just acknowledgement. The pretense had begun. The family that had deliberately excluded me now performed respect with the desperate energy of actors who had forgotten their lines and were improvising frantically. But beneath their sudden politeness, I could see the truth. Respect compelled was not respect at all. The truth behind Colonel Anderson's unexpected arrival unfolded later that evening. My husband had reached out to him in secret, a desperate measure from a man torn between worlds. When we returned home that night, away from his family's judgmental eyes, he confessed everything while sitting at the edge of our bed, hands clasped tightly together. "I invited him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I couldn't stand up to them myself, but I knew the colonel would." The revelation struck me with mixed emotions. Part of me felt disappointed that my husband couldn't defend me himself, yet another part recognized the courage it took for him to seek help. In his own way, he had chosen me over his family's traditions. Colonel Anderson had been more than our commanding officer during training years ago. He had mentored both of us, watching my career progress with the same pride he showed his own daughter. When my husband called him explaining the situation, the senior officer didn't hesitate. "The colonel told me he'd been looking for an excuse to put your in-laws in their place for years," my husband explained with a small smile. "Apparently, they'd made similar remarks at military functions before." What appeared as a spontaneous visit was actually a carefully orchestrated intervention. Anderson had parked his vehicle down the street, timing his arrival for maximum impact, right when dinner tensions would be highest. His military precision extended beyond the battlefield to social warfare. The commander hadn't come just to rescue me from an uncomfortable dinner. His actions served a deeper purpose, to publicly affirm my worth as both a soldier and a person deserving respect. In the hierarchy-conscious environment of San Antonio's military community, his gesture carried weight that would ripple outward. "He said no officer under his command would be disrespected like that," my husband continued, "especially not one with your record." I remembered how the colonel had stood tall in his pressed uniform, how his eyes had swept the room with the same assessment he used before tactical decisions. He had transformed my isolation into a position of honor with a few carefully chosen words. His presence had been both shield and spotlight, protecting me from further humiliation while illuminating my achievements for all to see. What my husband couldn't accomplish with family ties, Anderson achieved through rank and reputation. "Thank you," I said finally, reaching for my husband's hand. "It wasn't perfect, but you found a way." The night's events had revealed not just my in-laws' prejudice, but also the unexpected allies standing ready to defend my place at the table, both literally and figuratively. At Colonel Anderson's insistence, I rose from my seat, feeling every eye in the room track my movement. The commander's presence had transformed the atmosphere, turning what had been a battleground of subtle cruelty into something resembling a military inspection. I straightened my shoulders, a reflex from years of service, and made my way toward the head of the table, the position traditionally reserved for the patriarch of the family. The wooden chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as I pulled it out, the sound cutting through the stunned silence like a knife. My father-in-law's face had drained of all color, his earlier confidence evaporating under the colonel's watchful gaze. My mother-in-law clutched her napkin so tightly her knuckles turned white, her previous smirk replaced by a thin, tense line. "Thank you, Colonel," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart against my ribs. As I lowered myself into the seat, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and discomfort. This wasn't how I had wanted to earn my place in this family. Yet there was undeniable power in occupying this symbolic position, the head of the table that represented authority and respect in Southern tradition. My husband watched from across the table, relief and anxiety battling across his features. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, perhaps the closest thing to public support he could muster in that moment. Colonel Anderson remained standing, his presence commanding respect without a single word. "I've served with Major for 7 years," he finally said, addressing the entire table but fixing his gaze particularly on my in-laws. "Her leadership has saved lives. The Army is fortunate to have her." The silence that followed was deafening. No one dared contradict him, not even my sister-in-law, who suddenly found her plate fascinating. The family that had moments ago felt entitled to exclude me now sat rigid, forced to acknowledge my worth through the lens of military hierarchy. I surveyed the table from my new vantage point. The empty plate before me stood in stark contrast to the abundance surrounding it. But the emptiness no longer felt like rejection. It felt like an opportunity to establish new boundaries. "I believe dinner was being served," I said quietly, my tone even but firm. The words hung in the air for only a moment before my mother-in-law hurriedly reached for the serving dishes. The family could no longer pretend I was invisible. My rank, my dignity, and my place at the table had been acknowledged, not through their acceptance, but through their inability to maintain the facade of exclusion under outside scrutiny. The transformation was immediate and almost comical. With Colonel Anderson's authoritative presence filling the room, my mother-in-law's face shifted from smug satisfaction to panicked hospitality. She practically leaped from her chair, grabbing the serving dish of brisket that had so deliberately bypassed me earlier. "Oh, I must have forgotten." "How terribly careless of me," she stammered, heaping slices of meat onto my plate with trembling hands. Her eyes darted nervously to the colonel, then back to me. "Please, have some more." "There's plenty." My father-in-law, who minutes before had been discussing my supposed coldness with neighbors, now offered the basket of cornbread with an outstretched arm and a strained smile. "Best batch my wife has ever made," he announced with forced enthusiasm. "Family recipe, you know." The sister-in-law who had whispered about me taking the spotlight now passed the green beans, her fingers white-knuckled around the serving spoon. "Would you like some sweet tea, Major?" she asked, emphasizing my rank with a sweetness that dripped like honey, but tasted of vinegar. I accepted each offering with the composed dignity my military training had instilled in me. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions beneath my calm exterior. The food before me, aromatic brisket, buttery cornbread, and perfectly seasoned vegetables, should have been appetizing, but each bite felt hollow. My husband sat beside me, relief washing over his features. He squeezed my hand under the table, a silent apology for his earlier paralysis. I returned the pressure, acknowledging his gesture while still nursing the wound of his silence. Colonel Anderson engaged the table in conversation about recent base activities, creating a buffer of professional dialogue that temporarily masked the tension. "Your daughter-in-law's leadership has been exemplary," he noted casually between bites, as if mentioning the weather. "Her unit's performance metrics are among the highest I've seen." The relatives who had excluded me now nodded and murmured agreement, as if they'd supported my career all along. My mother-in-law even attempted to claim pride in my accomplishments, though her words rang hollow against the memory of her earlier contempt. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing of the southern comfort food that filled my plate. The brisket, though tender and perfectly smoked, might as well have been cardboard. The cornbread crumbled between my fingers, dry despite its buttery glaze. What should have been a welcoming meal freely given had become a forced performance of respect. As I looked around at the suddenly solicitous faces, I realized that while I had gained my seat at the table, genuine acceptance remained elusive. The respect shown now was not for me, but for the rank and the man who recognized it. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I had finally been served, but the meal had lost its savor. Word travels fast in close-knit communities like San Antonio. By the following afternoon, the story of my dinner humiliation had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down called her friend at the grocery store, who told the postal carrier, who mentioned it to the school principal, and within 24 hours, everyone knew. "Did you hear what the Millers did to their daughter-in-law?" The Army major. I overheard a woman whisper at the local coffee shop 2 days later. "They refused to serve her food at their own dinner table." Can you imagine? My mother-in-law had spent decades cultivating her reputation for Southern hospitality. Her holiday gatherings and summer barbecues were legendary in the neighborhood. She prided herself on never letting anyone leave her home hungry, a point of honor in Texas social circles. Now that carefully constructed image was crumbling, the commander's intervention had transformed a private family slight into public knowledge. Colonel Anderson was well respected in both military and civilian circles in San Antonio, and his deliberate acknowledgement of my rank at the dinner table carried weight beyond our family dining room. "I heard the battalion commander himself had to step in," the barber on Main Street told his customers, made them give her the head seat at the table. Can you believe they treated a service member that way? The whispers grew louder when my father-in-law tried to attend his weekly poker game. His friends were noticeably cooler toward him. One even declined to pour him a drink, a subtle but unmistakable echo of what had happened at our family dinner. "Your wife crossed a line, Miller," one of his oldest friends finally said. "We respect our military in this town." My sister-in-law faced similar fallout at her book club when several members suddenly had scheduling conflicts that prevented them from hosting at her home. The community's judgment was silent, but palpable. I took no pleasure in their social discomfort, but there was a certain poetic justice to it all. The family that had tried to exclude me now found themselves excluded in turn. Their attempt to diminish me had backfired spectacularly. My husband seemed torn between embarrassment and relief. "Maybe now they'll understand," he said quietly one evening. "This town values service and respect. What they did to you, it goes against everything they claim to stand for." I nodded, knowing that the damage to his family's reputation couldn't be repaired with a simple apology or a make-up dinner. In San Antonio, where military service was revered and hospitality sacred, they had violated both codes at once. The community had noticed, and they wouldn't soon forget. The car ride home was filled with a silence as thick as the Texas humidity. I stared out the window, watching the streetlights blur past, each one illuminating the tension between us for just a moment before darkness returned. My husband's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in that familiar way I'd come to recognize during our 3 years of marriage. Back at our apartment, he finally broke. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking as he sat on the edge of our bed. "I should have said something when they wouldn't serve you." I just froze. I removed my earrings, placing them carefully on the nightstand. The military had taught me precision, even in moments of emotional turmoil. "You let them humiliate me," I said. the words measured but heavy with hurt. Your own wife. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times before. I know. I thought inviting Colonel Anderson would fix everything without me having to directly confront my parents. I thought it was the perfect solution. So you orchestrated the whole thing? The revelation stung worse than the original slight. You knew they might treat me that way, and your solution wasn't to stand up for me, but to bring in reinforcements? My family has always been this way, he admitted, eyes fixed on the floor. I've never been able to stand up to them. Not about my career choices, not about who I married. I thought the Colonel's presence would force them to respect you without causing a permanent rift. I sat beside him, close but not touching. I need a partner, not a strategist. What happens next time when there's no commanding officer to rescue me? There won't be a next time, he promised, reaching for my hand. Seeing you at the head of that table tonight, it changed something in me. I was proud and ashamed all at once. I wanted to believe him, but the memory of sitting alone with an empty plate while everyone around me ate was still too raw. I love you, I said finally, but I don't know if I can keep facing your family if you can't stand with me. He nodded slowly, understanding the ultimatum beneath my words. I won't let you down again. I promise. As we prepared for bed, I found myself caught in the painful space between forgiveness and self-preservation. The military had taught me to endure hardship without complaint, to push through discomfort for the greater mission. But this was different. This was family, or was supposed to be. And I wondered if the battle for acceptance in his family was one I could ever truly win, even with him finally promising to fight alongside me. The weeks following the dinner incident were anything but peaceful. My sister-in-law, Melissa, became the architect of a whisper campaign that spread through San Antonio's tight-knit military community like wildfire. At first it was subtle, sideways glances at the commissary, conversations that abruptly stopped when I approached. Then came the direct reports from sympathetic neighbors who felt I should know what was being said. She orchestrated the whole thing, Melissa had told the women at her book club, called in the commander because she couldn't handle a little family tension. Her voice, dripping with false concern, painted me as manipulative and attention-seeking. The irony wasn't lost on me, being accused of seeking attention when all I'd wanted was to be invisible during that humiliating dinner. At a neighborhood barbecue, I overheard her speaking with another military spouse. It's just so hard when someone uses their rank to intimidate civilians, she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. My brother married someone who brings her work home, if you know what I mean. Her jealousy was as transparent as glass. Before my arrival, she had been the family's pride, the accomplished daughter with the perfect Southern manners. Now she found herself overshadowed by a sister-in-law who had earned respect through service rather than social graces. Every promotion I received seemed to fuel her resentment further. What bothered her most, I suspected, was Colonel Anderson's intervention. The way he had acknowledged me, not as an interloper but as a valued officer, had undermined years of her carefully constructed narrative about what a proper family member should be. His respect for me had exposed the pettiness of their exclusion. My husband tried to mediate, suggesting we invite Melissa for coffee to clear the air. She's always been the center of attention, he explained one evening as we sat on our porch. Having Colonel Anderson treat you with such respect in front of everyone, it shook her world. I declined the coffee invitation. Years of military service had taught me that some battles weren't worth fighting. Instead, I focused on my work, letting my accomplishments speak for themselves. The gossip eventually reached Colonel Anderson himself. During a staff meeting, he paused beside my desk. Major, he said quietly. In my experience, those who resent earned authority often reveal more about themselves than about the person they criticize. With a knowing nod, he moved on, leaving me with the quiet assurance that my place, both in the military and at that infamous dinner table, had been rightfully earned. The weeks after the dinner incident stretched into months, and while I was no longer subjected to the humiliation of an empty plate, the atmosphere at family gatherings remained glacial. My mother-in-law would serve me with tight lips and averted eyes, as if the very act of acknowledging my presence pained her. The food always reached my plate now, but warmth never accompanied it. During a Sunday lunch at their San Antonio home, I noticed how conversation flowed freely until I entered a room. Then voices would drop to whispers or halt entirely. My sister-in-law would cast sidelong glances my way before leaning in to murmur something to my father-in-law, their shared laughter cutting through the silence like a knife. "Perhaps you'd like to share the joke," I said once, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. The room fell silent. Forks paused midair. "Just family matters," she replied with a dismissive wave. "Military stuff wouldn't interest you." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years navigating complex operations and commanding troops, yet here I was, deemed unworthy of simple dinner table conversation. My husband would squeeze my hand under the table during these moments, a silent apology for his family's behavior. He was trying harder now, occasionally redirecting conversations when they became particularly exclusionary, but the damage had been done. The chill remained. I drew on my military training to maintain composure. The same discipline that had carried me through desert deployments and grueling training exercises now helped me endure these gatherings with dignity. I sat straight-backed in my chair, spoke clearly when addressed, and refused to show how deeply their rejection wounded me. On the drive home, I would finally exhale, releasing the tension I'd been holding for hours. "They'll come around eventually," my husband would say, his optimism unwavering despite all evidence to the contrary. I nodded, not wanting to crush his hope but knowing better. The truth was, beneath my stoic exterior and carefully maintained composure, I still yearned for their acceptance. Not because I needed their validation, but because I wanted peace for my marriage and a sense of belonging that extended beyond my professional life. At night, I sometimes wondered if I should simply stop attending these gatherings altogether. But something in me refused to surrender ground once gained. I had earned my seat at that table, both literally and figuratively. No amount of cold shoulders or whispered insults would drive me from it now. The invitation arrived in an official envelope, crisp and white with the Army insignia embossed in the corner. After months of enduring the chilly atmosphere at family gatherings, I found myself holding something that filled me with both pride and apprehension. I was to be honored at a military ceremony in San Antonio for leadership excellence during our last deployment. "They'll have to acknowledge you now," my husband said, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and lingering guilt from that infamous dinner. He still struggled with his role in the conflict, torn between loyalty to me and the family traditions that had shaped him. I traced my fingers over the gold lettering of my name and rank. "I'm sending invitations to your parents," I told him. Despite everything, some part of me still yearned for their acceptance, or at least a truce in this cold war we'd been waging. The ceremony would be held at the Grand Hall downtown, a venue known for hosting military functions with appropriate gravity and decorum. As I addressed envelopes at our kitchen table, I imagined Colonel Anderson in his dress uniform, the community members in their Sunday best, and my in-laws. Would they even come? My husband placed his hand on my shoulder. "They'll be there," he assured me. "Dad might grumble, but they care too much about appearances to decline a formal military invitation." I sent invitations to everyone, my mother-in-law and father-in-law, my gossipy sister-in-law. neighbors who had witnessed the dinner incident, and colleagues who had supported me through the aftermath. Each envelope represented a hope that public recognition might finally bridge the gap that private resentment had created. 2 days later, my mother-in-law called. Not me, but my husband. She wanted to know what to wear, what time to arrive, where to park. She never once mentioned my achievement or congratulated me, but her attention to these details was its own kind of acknowledgement. "She's trying," my husband said after hanging up the phone, "in her own way." I nodded, though we both knew it wasn't enough. Still, I allowed myself to hope that seeing me honored, watching as my peers and superiors recognized my value, might force a measure of respect that family obligation alone had failed to generate. As the ceremony approached, I pressed my dress uniform, polished my shoes to a mirror shine, and practiced maintaining my composure. This wasn't just about medals or certificates. It was about claiming my place, not just at a dinner table, but in a family that had tried to exclude me from the start. The grand hall of the San Antonio Military Center gleamed under chandeliers that cast golden light across polished floors. I stood backstage in my pressed uniform, medals aligned with precision across my chest. Through a gap in the curtains, I watched as the room filled with rows of service members in their dress blues, their posture as straight as the creases in their uniforms. My husband squeezed my hand. "You deserve this," he whispered, his eyes reflecting a pride that had grown stronger in recent months. When I spotted my in-laws entering the hall, my stomach tightened. They moved as a unit, my mother-in-law in a navy dress that seemed deliberately understated, my father-in-law walking with the stiffness of someone attending out of obligation rather than celebration. They chose seats near the back, their faces set in neutral expressions that betrayed nothing of our troubled history. My sister-in-law trailed behind them, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for familiar faces to share her discomfort. The family arranged themselves in a row, creating a small island of civilian clothing amid the sea of uniforms. Colonel Anderson approached me backstage. "Ready, Major?" he asked, his voice carrying the same authority that had silenced the dining room months ago. I nodded, drawing strength from years of military discipline. When the ceremony began, I walked onto the stage with measured steps. The spotlight found me, and for a moment, I could see nothing beyond its glare. Then my vision adjusted, and I could make out faces in the crowd, colleagues who had served alongside me, neighbors who had heard the whispers about that infamous dinner, and in the distance, my husband's family, sitting rigid and watchful. "Major," the commanding general announced, his voice filling the hall, "for exceptional leadership during Operation Eastern Shield and continued excellence in service to this nation." The applause began like rainfall, scattered at first, then swelling into a thunderous wave that washed over the hall. I watched as my in-laws hesitated, then slowly joined in, their hands coming together in reluctant rhythm. My mother-in-law's face remained impassive, but my father-in-law nodded slightly, an acknowledgement so small it might have been missed by anyone not searching for it. It wasn't acceptance, it wasn't warmth. But as I stood there, receiving recognition for my service, I realized something had shifted. For the first time, they couldn't dismiss me or pretend I was less than I am. The uniform, the rank, the respect of my peers, these things existed independent of their approval. As I accepted my commendation, I caught my husband's eye. He was applauding loudest of all, no longer caught between worlds. After the ceremony, Colonel James Anderson made his way through the crowd with deliberate steps, his uniform crisp and authoritative. He approached my husband's family, who stood awkwardly in a tight cluster near the refreshment table. Their faces registered surprise as the commander extended his hand to my father-in-law first. "Your daughter-in-law is an exceptional officer," Colonel Anderson stated, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. "We're fortunate to have her leadership in our battalion." My mother-in-law's smile tightened as she clutched her purse. The commander continued, detailing my recent accomplishments with the precision of someone who had followed my career closely. He spoke of my deployment leadership, my strategic contributions to training protocols, and the respect I commanded among both superiors and subordinates. "You must be very proud," he said, his eyes meeting each family member's gaze in turn. Not many families can claim a major of her caliber in their ranks. From where I stood across the room, I could see my sister-in-law shift uncomfortably, the woman who had once spread rumors about my manipulation, now forced to nod along as the commander praised my integrity. "I remember that dinner at your home," Colonel Anderson continued, his tone casual but his words deliberate. "It's clear where she belongs in our military hierarchy. Her seat at any table is earned through merit and service." The reference to that humiliating evening months ago hung in the air. My father-in-law's face flushed red above his collar. The commander knew exactly what he was doing, addressing the slight without directly confronting it, using his position to cement my standing, not just in the military, but in the family structure they had tried to deny me. "We value tradition in the Army too," he added, "but we also value excellence. Your daughter-in-law exemplifies both." As he excused himself to speak with other guests, I watched my in-laws exchange glances. Something had shifted. The commander's words had transformed my achievements from a source of resentment into something they could potentially claim as a family point of pride. My husband approached them moments later, standing taller than I'd seen him in months. For the first time, he looked like a man who understood that supporting me wasn't a betrayal of his family, but rather an invitation for them to evolve. Colonel Anderson had given them no room for doubt or dismissal. My place at the table, both literally and figuratively, was earned and deserved. And now, everyone in the room knew it. The weeks following the ceremony marked a gradual shift in my relationship with my husband's family. Their open hostility had transformed into something more bearable, a reluctant tolerance that, while not warm, at least acknowledged my presence. I noticed my mother-in-law would now offer food without prompting, though her smile never quite reached her eyes. My father-in-law would nod in greeting when I entered a room, a small gesture that spoke volumes compared to his previous dismissal. The scars of that first dinner remained, however. Some wounds heal, but leave marks that remind you of past pain. During family gatherings, I still caught myself mentally preparing for exclusion, my military training kicking in as I strategized how to maintain dignity in potentially hostile territory. Yet with each passing month, I found myself less concerned with winning their approval and more focused on honoring my own worth. "You seem different," my husband remarked one evening as we drove home from his parents' house in San Antonio. "More at peace." I considered his observation. "I've stopped measuring my value by their acceptance," I replied. The realization had been liberating. I was a major who had earned her rank through dedication and service. Their approval, while once desperately sought, had become secondary to my own self-respect. Our marriage strengthened in unexpected ways through this adversity. My husband, who had once frozen in silence at that infamous dinner table, gradually found his voice. He began to stand up for me in small ways at first, redirecting conversations when his sister started her whispered commentary, or highlighting my accomplishments when his parents minimized them. "I should have done this from the beginning," he admitted one night. "Watching Colonel Anderson that day showed me what real support looks like." The community's perception had shifted as well. Neighbors who had once absorbed the gossip about me being too military now approached me with questions about service and leadership. Several young women from the neighborhood had even sought my advice about military careers, much to my sister-in-law's visible annoyance. At a recent family barbecue, I overheard my mother-in-law telling a friend, "My daughter-in-law is quite respected in her field." The words weren't warm, but they acknowledged a truth she had once tried to erase. The journey toward acceptance wasn't complete. Perhaps it never would be. But I had found something more valuable than their approval. The certainty that I belonged at the table not because someone else placed me there, but because I had earned my seat through my own merit and resilience. Family dinners in San Antonio took on a new rhythm in the months that followed. When I walked into my in-laws' home, the air still carried a certain tension, but it was no longer the suffocating hostility of that infamous night. My mother-in-law would offer a tight smile as she passed the cornbread, while my father-in-law acknowledged my presence with a curt nod, small gestures that once seemed impossible. I no longer measured my worth by their approval. The empty plate incident had taught me something valuable about standing my ground, even when tradition and family expectations pushed against me. Colonel Anderson's intervention had been a catalyst, but the real change came from within. My husband found his voice eventually. The man who once sat frozen beside me now made a point of serving my plate first, a subtle rebellion against his upbringing. "My wife deserves respect," he told his sister one Sunday when she made a passing comment about my military manner. The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence. The sister-in-law still whispered behind cupped hands occasionally, her jealousy never fully subsiding. Yet even she seemed to recognize that the tide had turned in the community. Neighbors who once absorbed gossip about me now asked about my career with genuine interest. At Christmas dinner, something remarkable happened. My father-in-law, after 3 glasses of whiskey, asked me about Army leadership principles. "Might help with my business?" he mumbled, not quite meeting my eyes. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement, the closest thing to acceptance I might ever receive. The dining table that once served as a battlefield became neutral territory. We developed an unspoken agreement. They would acknowledge my rank and accomplishments, and I would respect their traditions without surrendering my identity. It wasn't perfect harmony, but it was livable peace. Sometimes I caught my mother-in-law watching me with a puzzled expression, as if trying to reconcile the woman before her with the outsider she had once tried to exclude. The military bearing that had once offended her now seemed to intrigue her. The clash between military respect and Southern tradition had created something new, a family dynamic that bent without breaking, that made room for difference without demanding conformity. I had learned that belonging doesn't always mean being embraced. Sometimes it means carving out your own space and standing firmly within it. When we gather now around that long table, I take my seat neither at the head nor in the shadows, but exactly where I choose to be. A major, a wife, a daughter-in-law, all parts of me, claimed on my own terms,